How long should you be doing an exercise before you decide to switch? What's up, guys? My name is John Evans. I coach the highest jumper in the world, Isaiah Rivera. He has a 50.5-inch measured vertical leap. And in today's episode, I am going to tell you guys how long you need to do a given exercise or address a certain quality before you move on to the next because you've milked the max adaptation. Now, the way that this question was actually worded to me was along the lines of how long do I need to do a given exercise, in terms of mesocycles and macrocycles. I'm not going to go into too much of the periodization aspect. Maybe towards the end I will, but we're really just going to break this down to the fundamental basics of understanding training and adaptation, and then we're going to help guide the conversation depending on the answer to which capacity you're addressing and how long it takes to get an adaptation that you want to see, or the desired adaptation. So the first thing you need to understand is that the said principle that you have a specific adaptation to an imposed demand, right? And if we're a speed jumper, we're a speed or power athlete or strength athlete, then that means that the goal that we're trying to achieve is getting ourselves more powerful. We're trying to get ourselves stronger or faster. And to achieve those goals, we need to impose a demand on the body. We need to ask the body to produce a lot of force really quickly so that we see an adaptation in that direction. This isn't necessarily true of just speed power. This is actually true of every single sport where a physical quality needs to be addressed, whether it's basketball or it's distance running or it's dunking or it's sprinting. You have to ask yourself, which capacity are you trying to improve? So we need to pick a capacity, which I will just use strength because that's a pretty easy one. The 5 biomotor capacities that I look at strength, speed, coordination, endurance, and mobility. Each of those physical capacities has subcategories that you could put underneath it. We're just gonna look at max strength. So for the first capacity, we're gonna say strength. How long does it take to see an adaptation in strength? Now, inside of this, and this is maybe where a little bit of knowledge of exercise science or sports science comes in, or physiology, you have to ask yourself, what processes are we actually trying to change when we want to see an adaptation to strength? So if I'm looking at, say, the back squat, and I want to know how long do I need to do a given exercise before I'm going to see the maximum amount of adaptation and I should probably move on. Obviously, you could look at research and you could say, well, we see these strength and diminishing returns start to happen from this given exercise for an amount of time. You're going to see a lot of different things. You'll see some research that says you need 3 sessions a week for 4 weeks before you can move on. You're going to see progressive overload, all these other training laws kind of apply. That's absolutely true. But what we're really trying to do is we're trying to manipulate your physiology, and we need to know what the timelines are and the amount of stress that we have to apply to that given system before it is maximally adapted to whatever that stressor is. In short, in general, what I was taught, according to my mentors, was roughly 3 to 4 weeks before we start to see strong diminishing returns happen. But we want to see, we're going to go through this process and kind of talk about specifically the squat. So which physiological processes are we trying to get to adapt when we're doing a squat? Well, one, we're trying to see tendon adaptation, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how does tendon adaptation happen? We know tendon adaptation happens when you meet a time component and you meet a tension component. And you can look at the research on this, but it's around 70%-ish of maximal voluntary contraction, and the time component is roughly 5 minutes of loading. And this is according to Keith Barr's research. In a given rep, it might be upwards of 45 seconds before you start to see a tenocyte stressed enough to start to produce collagen matrix, which will allow you to have a more resilient tendon. If we're a jumping athlete and we're programming squats, that's one of the adaptations that we want to see. So what physiological process are we looking at? We're looking at tendon adaptation. We're looking at how long it takes tendon adaptation to happen, whether it's intra-session or it's intra-set. And then we're also looking at the long-term adaptation and how long does it take and how many times can you stress it before you start to see that reach diminishing returns and you need to move on to a different exercise. So that is one of the processes. Another one is your nervous system. How long does your nervous system take to adapt to a session of squatting? We've seen some research say that in the first week you see the most adaptation, and then the next week you see a little less, the next week you see a little less, the next week you see a little less, and then it pretty much flattens out at a very slow increase in adaptation up to 16 weeks. Now, that research will indicate that you can do squats, and I don't have the research on hand directly next to me, but you can look this up, fact check me on this, that you could do an exercise for 16 weeks and you could still see neural adaptations and muscular adaptations happen all the way through 16 weeks. And some research will indicate that the first week or two, you've basically maxed out the adaptation to that given exercise. So we know the nervous system is maxing out at roughly 2 to 4 weeks, right? But we're also seeing the strength or the cross-sectional area of a muscle change upwards of 16 weeks. So the strength change might change over 16 weeks, but most of that might have occurred from neuromuscular changes in the first week to 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, up to 8 weeks and 16 weeks, most of the changes in strength could be attributed to cross-sectional area, which you could measure the size of your muscle and the strength gains and say there were no changes in strength in cross-sectional area the first 4 weeks, or not significant changes, but over 16 weeks we saw massive changes, and so we can attribute those strength changes to the cross-sectional area. So again, what physiological process are we looking at? In this case, it was the nervous system, but we also talked about muscles. You could see cross-sectional area change in the muscle, but it would happen over 16 weeks. So if I'm looking at an athlete and I'm saying, how long does this given process take? 16 weeks for a squat to allow for maximal cross-sectional changes in cross-sectional area before there's diminishing returns and not really a change from that given exercise. Now, if you're adding in progressive overload or you're adding in variety, now things start to become a little bit more convoluted. And now we can actually see more adaptation be spurred on over a longer period of time because we've started to integrate some of those other aspects. What other physiological process do we want to see if we're using a squat? We've addressed the muscle cross-sectional area, which in this case hopefully is type 2 fibers. We've addressed the nervous system. We've addressed the tendon. Maybe you're addressing in some sense the kinetics and kinematics if you're looking at the biomechanics of it, meaning we've addressed the biology part, the physiological aspect, but now we're looking at the mechanical aspects. Is it around the range of motion that we need to see happen in whatever given activity we're trying to improve in? If it's a squat, and this is back to the needs analysis, and I'm looking at a 1-foot jumper, deep squatting is going to be less of a need for me to improve in terms of biomechanics, because biomechanically I'm not ever in a deep squat when I'm 1-foot jumping. That will also tell us how long we need to spend on a given exercise. And this maybe comes full picture or full circle back to periodization and back to the annual plan of mesocycles and macrocycles. A macrocycle for me is typically 6 months to 12 months. If I'm working in track and field athletes, that's because it's a biannually, they have 2 big events. If I'm working with a dunker, same thing. They typically have 2 big peaking periods or months, usually in the winter around All-Star weekend, and in the summer they'll have a lot of events usually in Europe. If you're Isaiah or Dom or Donovan or some of these other guys that I work with. In that scenario, I am typically doing a full needs analysis, which I kind of have done numerous times, and I'm looking at those adaptation windows, and I'm deciding how long I want to keep a given exercise in. So I went through a squat, but you could do this for a number of exercises. You could do it for sprinting. You could do it for endurance running. We really only covered strength work, but you could talk about how long it takes for adaptation to happen in sprinting, and that is even slower, right? We see neuromuscular changes happen there progressively, maybe in research over the first week or two, and then it really drops off fast in terms of how fast you get faster. It's a very difficult thing to change. It's a very difficult thing to see adaptation to. The tendon plays a role, the nervous system plays a role, the muscular force plays a role, and the muscle size plays a role, your body weight plays a role. It's very complex to just get better at the skill of running faster. The same thing's true of jumping. That's why it changes so slowly. We can see massive changes in strength work, and that's why, again, which capacity are we looking at? We can see massive changes happen in 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Sprinting, maybe you have a newbie get faster in the first week or two, or jumping, you get better in the first week or two, and then they'll fall off really fast. That's a normal expectation because that capacity of power or speed is more difficult to improve on over time. It's a more sensitive metric. It involves more processes, and those processes have way more limitations, specifically time, that you don't have to deal with when it comes to strength. Endurance, we could quickly go through. You're looking at the enzymes in the body. You're looking at the ability to transfer oxygen, which is aerobic glycolysis. You're looking at oxidative phosphorylation. All of those processes change very quickly and continue to change day to day. That could change. So that's why a distance runner has to go out and train even every day and address that physical capacity. So it's important to know which capacity are you looking at, what physiological processes do you want to see, or what are you addressing, and how long does it take for that given physiological process to either be stressed and have recovered from, and then when do you start to see diminishing returns. That's the video, guys. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in getting coached by me, go to THPStrength.com and sign up if you want to be a better athlete today. See you guys.